Welcome to Sage Audio. Today we're doing a vocal masterclass. To get the most from your music, consider watching the entirety of each chapter because each chapter builds from the previous to create a complete understanding of the topic. If you have a mix that you need mastered, consider sending it to us to receive a free mastered sample of it with the link in the description. The frequencies of a vocal. The voice resides between 100 Hz all the way up to about 18 kHz. It's an incredibly complex instrument, but let's break down its frequencies. Between 100 to 300 Hz will be the vocal's fundamental. 500 Hz will be where the pronunciation of vowels occur, and 700 to 1 kHz is where you get nasally resonances. With this in mind, I'm going to use a high-pass filter up to 100 Hz with a small boost on the key's fundamental. I'll gently boost 500 Hz to make the vocal more intelligible, but I could also cut it to make the vocal sit further back in a mix. If the vocal sounds nasally, I'll find where this is happening between 700 Hz to 1 kHz and dip that until I no longer hear unwanted nasal tones. Let's listen to these changes. The frequencies of a vocal, part 2. Next, let's talk about vocal clarity, sibilance, and air. Perceived clarity resides somewhere between 1 kHz and 4 kHz. What you boost depends on the vocal and the mix, but I usually find 2 kHz to be a good starting point to boost, and then I'll move the band around until I find the exact section I want to boost. A 1 octave bandwidth works well here. For sibilance, which is between 4 kHz and 11 kHz, we have a couple of options. We can use an EQ to dip it, a dynamic EQ to dip it, or a de-esser, which is basically a high-frequency compressor. I like to use a dynamic EQ mixed with de-essing to tame sibilance here. Last up, I'm going to use a shelf to boost the air of the vocal. This adds somewhat to clarity, but mainly gives a vocal a delicate, sometimes ethereal feel. Describing the purpose of an air band is a little difficult. It's one of those things you understand when you hear it. Let's take a listen to it. If you're enjoying the video, consider hitting the like button. It really helps us bring you more videos. Dynamic range of a vocal. Compressing a vocal is difficult and needs to be controlled, but since the voice is so familiar to us, we can easily hear when it sounds compressed. To remedy this, I like to use 3 compressors, each with different purposes: peak down, RMS down, and upward in that order. Peak down compression works by attenuating the vocal's peaks downward. RMS measures the loudness of the vocal and compresses from the loudest points down. Upward compression measures the signal from the noise floor up and compresses and amplifies it, which adds a lot of detail. I get a few dB of attenuation from the 2 downward compressors, but use more aggressive, low-level compression since it's less noticeable. Let's use quick attacks for the downward compressors and a release of about 50 milliseconds to retain detail without distortion. Let's take a listen. Why saturation is so important. Saturation gently compresses, but more importantly, it forms harmonics which alter a vocal's timbre, frequency, perceived loudness, and cause a psychoacoustic effect in which the fundamental is generated in the mind of the listener. With an EQ, we can boost the fundamental and harmonics, but these frequencies change. Whenever a new note is sung, the fundamental changes. Since saturation works with this fundamental, it'll follow it whenever it changes. Use multiple saturation types and maybe an exciter to create a complex array of these harmonics for your vocal. Let's take a listen. resonant frequencies, and soothe to. Because vocal notes are changing, so too are the resonant frequencies. With that in mind, attenuating them can be challenging, but Soothe to lets you do this dynamically. Now, know that you don't need to use this plugin, but it does help with some subtle issues that arise when you're working with vocals. I'll use the soft option with a low depth and higher rendering and oversampling options to make it as accurate as possible and to avoid phase issues. Let's take a listen. Only a small percentage of people that watch our videos are subscribed, so if you're enjoying the video, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind. Separate your breaths and sibilants. To better control difficult parts of the vocal, let's find the breaths and sibilants in the actual track, isolate them, and then add them to a new track. We'll lower the level of this track and add whatever processors we need, such as compressors, equalizers, and so on. For a cool effect, we can add some reverb and compensate for its gain changes to soften the sibilants. Let's take a listen. Three types of vocal reverb. I'm going to use 3 different types of reverb on my vocal. The first, a super short room or ambient reverb to thicken the vocal. The second will be a medium length reverb with dense reflections and an emphasis on the mid-range. This way the vocal blends in. Last up, I'll use a long, stylistic reverb to give the vocal character and an identity separate from the surrounding instrumentation. Let's listen to these 3 types of reverb. If you're enjoying the channel, consider supporting us by joining with the link in the description to help us bring you more videos and content. Doubling and modulation. When trying to make your vocals sound thick, you can use a doubling plugin, a short delay, modulation like a chorus effect, or a combination of these effects. Doubling is going to introduce a very quick delay to create 2 distinct voices that are still perceived as coming from the same source. Modulation will shift one of these voices, typically with a modulating frequency or timing, to add more variation to the doubled signal. Let's take a listen. Reamping or impulse response. Reamping your vocal is a great way to change the signal's timbre and create a more complex response. You can reamp your vocal using physical components like a speaker and then re-record that speaker, or you could use a plugin that uses impulse responses to recreate the effect. I'll use a plugin for this and place it at the beginning of my chain to affect all of the processing that comes later. Let's take a listen. If you have a mix that you need mastered, consider sending it to us to receive a free mastered sample of it with the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching.